So the last energy metabolism hormone that I want to talk about is cortisol. What happens when it's elevated and what conditions we see it elevated in, and what the purpose of cortisol is. Cortisol is secreted by the adrenal glands, and really it's a energy metabolism hormone that is designed to help the body recover from an acute stress event. An acute stress being the fight or flight response. So you're running from a lion, tiger, bear kind of response. And when we have that kind of acute stress in nature, that would mean that we usually had a very intense athletic event that went along with it, and possibly injury. And so really cortisol, even though we hear it couched in really negative terms, it's actually a hormone that's released to help us recover from these acute stress events. Cortisol, when it's released in response to an acute event, drives systemic inflammation in the body. Now, inflammation is another thing that we hear couched in really negative terms, but when we're talking about cortisol and when we're talking about inflammation, it's really important to understand that the purpose of those is really that they are both the first step of healing in the body. We run into problems when they become chronic. When both cortisol and inflammation become a chronic issue rather than an acute issue, it has really the opposite effect, where it increases the breakdown of tissues. But within the body, it's important to understand that if we don't have inflammation, we don't have healing. And so a good picture of this is we've called injuries to the tendon tendinitises for decades. And what they found is that when they actually biopsy those tendons, instead of finding inflammation, what they find is a failed healing response and a breakdown of the collagen matrix of the tendon. So the problem in those sorts of conditions isn't inflammation. The problem is actually a lack of inflammation. So no inflammation, no healing. But if that inflammation doesn't have a chance to come in and do its job and it becomes chronic, that's when you end up with breakdown issues. And really the same is true of cortisol. So cortisol is a hormone that's secreted to help you build up and repair new tissues. And then the cortisol in the ideal world comes back down to a normal baseline after the body has had an opportunity to heal. The problem is that we live in a world where our body is being constantly signaled to release cortisol. Things that signal the body to release cortisol, one of them, low blood sugar. Here we go right back to when we get into that cycle of eating sugary foods, over-secreting insulin, dropping into hypoglycemia. Every time that we go through that cycle of dropping into hypoglycemia, we are giving a signal to our adrenal glands to release cortisol. And so if we're constantly doing that and never getting out of that hypoglycemia cycle, we will find chronically elevated cortisol levels. Another thing that causes our body to release cortisol is stress. So that can be either physiologic stress or it can be psychological stress. Stress is stress in our body. Our body does not differentiate between source, whether that was something physical, something emotional, something psychological. All of those are registered as stresses. And I think it's really important to make a quick note about stress. We need stress. The human body is designed to have stress and recovery from stress. And here again, just like cortisol and inflammation, it's another thing that we tend to think of in a really negative way. But the fact of the matter is that stress is what causes growth in our body, in our mind, in our spirit, in our emotions. It's just that the stress needs to be balanced with recovery. And so I think the easiest picture of this is to think about athletic training. If you don't stress a muscle, you will never grow a muscle. You'll never grow the bone density. All of these things grow in response to a stress that's put on them. But if we don't give that bone recovery and we keep stressing the bone, eventually we can cause a stress fracture. So it's a really great picture of that need to balance the stress with the recovery, because the strengthening and the repair happens in the recovery. So you don't get stronger while you're working out, you get stronger in your recovery period. And that's the same with all of these kinds of stresses that are applied to the body. The stress itself isn't bad. The lack of recovery following the stress or the outpacing of the stress beyond the capacity of the body and the ability to recover is where we end up with long-term problems. And so when we get into those cycles of stress without recovery, and whether that's because of athletic training, whether that's because of life events, whether that's because of trauma, we end up in this state of chronic elevated cortisol levels. Another really interesting thing that will elevate cortisol levels is sleep deprivation. This is challenging because, first of all, we live in a society that really values going, moving, being busy, and tends to not value stillness and recovery as much. And so already there you see in America a state where the majority of people are suffering from chronic sleep deprivation. And then you add psychological and physical trauma to that disturbs sleep. That alone will get you into a state where you have chronically elevated cortisol levels. So what happens when we have elevated cortisol levels? We're going to see our energy tank. We tend to see, really elevated blood pressure, decreased immune function. It stimulates our appetite and our drive to eat, again, foods that are high in salt, high in sugar, and high in fat. It really directs us to build up visceral fat and fat around our midsection when we have elevated cortisol levels. And then those fats set up an inflammatory cycle that kind of drives itself into a storm. The elevated cortisol will also move us into that place of leptin resistance. So all of these hormones function together either to bring us into a state of low energy or to release us from a state of low energy. And so when we're talking about the energy balance hormones, really the take home of that is that if we understand that we can change our diet and we can remove simple sugars, simple carbohydrates at the very least, and we're able to bring our blood sugar down to a healthy, normal level, all of a sudden that will trigger our energy hormones to live in a state of balance where our body feels okay releasing energy so that we can go ahead and live our lives fully.